You know, there are moments in the life of a nation that aren't about policy and aren't about elections. They're about something deeper. Something that reminds us we're all just people. Mortal. Fragile. Capable of love and loss. A funeral is one of those moments. And yesterday at the Washington National Cathedral, this country had a chance to show what that kind of moment looks like at its best. Lindsey Graham, a man who served South Carolina and this country for more than 30 years, was laid to rest. World leaders were present. His sister Darlene was sitting right there in the front row. And the President of the United States stood up to deliver a eulogy. Now, I want to be fair about what happened, because most of the coverage this morning picked up one or two clips, ran them on a loop, and moved on. But what they didn't show you is the full sequence, how the eulogy started on script, and then slowly, deliberately, drifted into something else entirely. The Blue Bill laid out that full arc this morning. And once you see the shift happen in real time, the tone change hits differently. Let me give you the big picture, because I think what happened at that cathedral yesterday matters. Not just for Lindsey Graham's memory, but for something larger about the country we're trying to hold together. And I want to walk through it the way I saw it, step by step, because the details here are important. Now, let me start by saying something that I mean sincerely. Lindsey Graham was a complicated man, and I respected him. We didn't agree on everything. Lord knows we didn't. But Lindsey had a quality that is increasingly rare in Washington. He could sit across from you, disagree with you on just about every policy position you held, and still make you feel like the conversation mattered. I experienced that firsthand. During my time in the White House, Lindsey was one of the Republicans who would actually pick up the phone and talk through a problem. Not to score points, not to set up a Sunday show appearance, just to understand where the other side was coming from. And that is a gift. You don't have to share someone's politics to recognize when they bring something real to the process. Lindsey Graham served in the Air Force. He was a JAG officer. He lost both his parents before he was old enough to vote, and he raised his younger sister Darlene practically on his own. He came up through the state legislature, went to the House, then to the Senate. He became one of the most recognizable voices on national security, foreign policy, and judicial appointments. He died on July 11th suddenly from an aortic dissection. He was 71 years old. And on Tuesday at the National Cathedral with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ukrainian President Zelensky and Vice President Vance and hundreds of mourners in attendance, the president stood up to say goodbye. And parts of what he said were genuinely moving. I want to acknowledge that. But something else happened, too. And this is where things start to get complicated. The president's eulogy ran about 14 minutes. And for a stretch of it, he did what a eulogy is supposed to do. He talked about Lindsey's legislative accomplishments. He said, and I'm going to put this in my own words here, that nothing of consequence happened in Washington without Lindsey Graham being involved. That's a fair tribute. That's the kind of thing you say when a man has given 3 decades of his life to public service. But then the president veered off script. He read a line that said, virtually everyone, Republican or Democrat, liked Lindsey. And he stopped. He looked up from the page and said, well, not everybody. Not everybody. He was a tough cookie. He said he had to veer from the script for a second. Now look, some folks will tell you that was just Trump being Trump, that he was being candid, being real, showing affection in his own way. And I'll grant that there is something human about a speaker who can't quite stick to a prepared text. I've been there. Every president has been there. But here's the honest truth. A eulogy is not a roast. A funeral is not a rally. Lindsey Graham's family was sitting right there. His sister, who just lost the most important person in her life, was in the front row. And when you decide in that moment to go off script, to remind everyone that not everybody actually liked the deceased, that's a choice. And it tells you something about how you see that moment, whether it belongs to the person in the casket, or whether it belongs to you. And then it went further. The president recounted what he described as one of his last phone conversations with Lindsey Graham. And you might expect at a funeral for that story to be about friendship, maybe a quiet word, maybe a personal moment they shared. But the story the president told was about legislation. He said, Lindsey called him and said, "We're all set for the Save America Act." He said, Lindsey was pushing the Save America Act like crazy. Now, I want to stop here because this is the part that most people heard about, but very few people have actually thought through. The Save America Act is not some minor procedural update. It is a sweeping piece of legislation that would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. A passport, a birth certificate, a real ID that specifically indicates citizenship. It would most mail-in registration. It would overhaul online voter registration systems. And it would impose criminal penalties up to 5 years in prison on election workers who register someone without the correct paperwork. But here's what I want to ask you. Do you know whether your current registration would survive that requirement? Do you know if the documents you used 10 or 15 years ago when you first registered would still be accepted under this new standard? Most people don't. The blue bill mapped out this morning which forms of ID would and wouldn't qualify. And if you've ever registered by mail or online, you need to see where you stand. I would recommend reading it. Now, here's why that matters going forward. When a president stands at a funeral and turns a dying man's last phone call into a pitch for voter eligibility legislation, he is making a statement not just about Lindsey Graham, but about what he believes that moment is for. And I think this is where we have to be honest with ourselves about what's happening to the way we treat our institutions. I served 2 terms. I gave eulogies. I stood in rooms full of people who were grieving. And I can tell you the hardest part of speaking at a funeral isn't finding the right words. It's finding the discipline to make the moment about the person who's gone, not about yourself. That takes restraint. It takes the kind of humility that says, today is not my day. Today belongs to the family. Today belongs to the legacy of someone who gave their life to this country. And I understand the argument that Lindsey Graham really did care about the Save America Act. I'm sure he did. He cared about a lot of legislation. But the choice to spend precious minutes of a eulogy recounting how a dead man's last phone call was about your legislative priority. That is a choice that collapses the boundary between mourning and messaging. And once that boundary is gone, it is very hard to rebuild. Because if a funeral is fair game for political promotion, then nothing is sacred. No institution, no ceremony, no tradition is off limits. And that erosion, that slow wearing down of the norms that hold a democracy together, that is what concerns me most about what happened yesterday. Let me tell you something about the Save America Act that I think gets lost in all the noise around the funeral itself. This bill has already passed the House in February of this year on a 218 to 213 vote. It failed in the Senate. 4 Republican senators voted against it. Lisa Murkowski voted against even bringing it to the floor. So, then the House tried something else. On July 23rd, 5 days before the funeral, they attached the Save America Act to the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2027, a defense spending bill. They also slipped pieces of the Voter ID Act into a congressional stock trading bill. 2 separate attempts to bury voter restriction provisions inside must-pass legislation. That's the legislative environment that was simmering in the background when the president stood up at that cathedral. And I'll be honest, I served 2 terms, and I hadn't seen anyone lay out how the reconciliation incentive structure in this new version actually works at the state level until the blue bill pointed it out this morning. That changes how you read the entire Senate strategy around this bill. Because this is not a story about a funeral anymore. This is a story about political leverage, about using every available platform, including a man's memorial service, to build momentum for a piece of legislation that the Senate has repeatedly refused to pass. So what happens now? I think you have to consider a few things. First, the funeral footage is going to circulate. The clip of the president going off script, the Save Act comments, the moment he appeared to fall asleep during other speakers' eulogies. All of that is now part of the public conversation, and it is going to shape how voters feel about the man in the Oval Office heading into the midterms. Second, the Save America Act is not dead. The House has shown it is willing to attach this bill to anything that moves. Defense spending, stock trading reform, budget reconciliation. They are going to keep trying. And every time they try, the question voters need to ask themselves is simple. Does this bill make it easier or harder for eligible American citizens to vote? Because the nonpartisan analyses are clear. The Brennan Center, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Campaign Legal Center, they have all said the same thing. Non-citizen voting in federal elections is already illegal. Instances of it are extremely rare, and the documentation requirements in this bill would create significant new barriers for millions of eligible citizens who don't carry a passport or a certified birth certificate. Seniors, rural voters, married women who changed their names, young people who registered online. These are the Americans who would be affected. And third, and this is the part one keep coming back to, the president matters. If a president can turn a funeral into a legislative pitch, and the public reaction is just a day of tweets, and then we move on, then we have accepted something that we should not accept. We have said that decorum doesn't matter, that institutions don't matter, that the dignity of death doesn't matter if the political winds are blowing hard enough. Now look, I want to close with this because I think it's the most important thing I can say today. America has always been a country that argues. We argue loudly. We argue passionately. And sometimes we argue ugly. That's not new. What is new, what worries me, is the idea that there are no spaces left where the argument stops, where we just show up as human beings and honor each other. A funeral used to be that space. It used to be the one place where the jersey came off, and you just stood there as a person next to other people acknowledging that life is short and service matters. What happened at the National Cathedral yesterday was a signal that even that space is being claimed for politics. And I don't say that with anger. I say that with concern. Because if we lose the ability to set the argument down even for an hour, even for a eulogy, then we are losing something that no legislation can restore. And the next time someone at your dinner table tells you the Save America Act is just common sense voter protection, ask them why the president needed to promote it at a funeral if the votes were already there. The blue bill broke down the Senate math this morning. Show them where the count actually stands. That's when the real conversation starts. Because democracy is not just what happens on the Senate floor. It's what happens in the spaces between at the kitchen table, at the town hall, at the funeral of a man who gave his life to this country. And those spaces deserve better than what they got yesterday. I believe that. I think most Americans believe that too. And I think if we're honest with each other, we can find our way back to the kind of country that knows the difference between a rally and a farewell. We've done it before. We can do it again. But only if we decide together that some things are still sacred.